and then see themselves as very much tied into the prior Abrahamic religions. And so when we say Abrahamic religions, we mean Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That Muhammad, when he was born in the 6th century and lived into the 7th century, he had significant experiences in his family and even in the surrounding community with Jews and Christians. A lot of the even Islamic practices are probably based on certain Jewish practices or Christian practices. Like, for example, following Christian desert fathers who would go out into the desert and pray and practice fasting and self-denial. This was a fairly prominent, decently well-known practice for some in the Near East, in that area of the world. And in and around Mecca, where Muhammad was born, he would participate in some of this. His family, they were the caretakers of this central shrine in Mecca called the Kaaba, this big black box that you'll see it in movies or on television. This is the one that Muslims go around during the Hajj. You'll see them, passing around in several circles. And when Muslims pray 5 times a day, they're putting their forehead to the floor toward the Kaaba. So if you're in Fargo, Moorhead, North Dakota, you probably face somewhere like southeast, and they're in mosques all over the place. You'll see a little niche, like a little indentation in the wall. That's the direction toward the Kaaba. Tradition has it this was built by Abraham, and that in it, in Muhammad's own time, there were images of Mary and Jesus, and in a lot of ways, Muslims pay great homage to Jewish and Christian figures. I think I mentioned last time that in the Quran, the woman who is mentioned more than any other woman is Mary. And there's great reverence for Jesus. Jesus is seen to be sinless. Jesus is seen to be a prophet and a messenger, just not the Son of God. Jesus is seen to be an earthly prophet, just like Muhammad is, just like Moses was, all of that, right? So great reverence for all of the all of the Jewish and Christian traditions here. Hold on one second. I think I'm ready to share screen. So let us do this. And I think we have it back up now. Let me enlarge it just a bit. So we were talking about the Near East, we were talking about Muhammad, then we were talking about some of the, the ties in with Jewish and Christian traditions. Muslims will view Muslims will view Jews and Christians as people of the book. The idea is that to every people are given books and prophets. And so, to the Jews, given the Torah and Moses and several other prophets. To the Christians, is given the Gospels and Jesus and John, and there are other books and prophets around the world. God comes to human beings in God's mercy and love, and gives guidance to help human beings pass through this life. The saying in the traditions that become known as the Hadith, as Muhammad is living, he's delivering these Quranic messages, these revelations coming through the angel Gabriel that are direct sort of recitation from the mother book in the heavens. And as he's doing that, his followers are also recording things that he did and things that he said. They'd be sitting around a campfire at night and they'd be asking him, what is the nature of God? And we have the revelations. God is mercy and beneficence and love and splendor. And there are 99 different names for God in the Quran. But then he would go on and talk about this. What does this mean? What does it mean for us? What are we to be like? How do we behave? This becomes known as the Hadith. And so for all Muslims, following the Quran is really important, but also following in the traditions of the Prophet also becomes really important. So the word Hadith just simply means report. And these are reports of things that Muhammad did and said, and then even his significant followers. He had several prominent followers as he was, especially in the final 10 years of his life. He had many, many, many people converting in the Arabian Peninsula. By the time he dies in 632, he has converted basically the entire Arabian Peninsula to Islam, although there remain significant numbers of Jews and Christians and, you know, a few others as well. But most of the kind of, there were goddess worshippers and all sorts of other kind of pagan traditions. Most had converted by the time he dies in 632. And some of these prominent ones are sort of gathered around him. And he then, his followers copy down things that he and his, his other prominent followers said and did. And so this becomes known as the Hadith. It starts really becoming a way of life toward the end of his, toward the end of his life. It's a way that all people can, it's more than just a few scant revelations. It really starts filling in and really starting to become a culture. By the time he dies, there are so many things well established. The Islamic community has a full sense of the way that Muhammad lived. They have their holy revelation, and then they seek to sort of live this out and bring it out to the world. Excuse me. So we can talk about, in a lot of ways, Islam grows quite rapidly in his own lifetime. If you think about it, at any period in history, the spread of a religion, for it to occur within a 10-year period, say, to an area the size of Saudi Arabia, for that to occur, that's significant growth. And then even after Muhammad dies, and they begin to sort of codify the religion and sort of establish it as a way of life, they set up kind of political, rules that govern the Islamic community, and they have ideas of succession. After Muhammad, there are a couple of differences, and this creates the split that we talked about last time between Sunnis and Shia. But for the most part, in most areas of the Muslim world, it's really becoming a way of life. It's becoming a culture. It's becoming a civilization in a lot of ways. Within 100 years after Muhammad dies, by about the year 750, Islam has spread up to the doorstep of India, so up into modern day Pakistan, all the way across North Africa. So that includes Egypt and Jordan and Syria on up to Turkey. It includes across North Africa and even up into southern Spain, cities like Cordoba and other places. Within 100 years after Muhammad dies, Islam has spread as the predominant religion that it, in a lot of ways, is similar in size and scope to maybe the Roman Empire. And if you think about it, it's really significant, that kind of growth. I mean, it's almost unprecedented, especially if you add in the time component. They say that Rome wasn't built in a day, right? But in a lot of ways, Islam and Islamic culture and civilization, it wasn't built in a day, but it was built in 100 years. And that's significant. A few other examples, maybe. I mean, the way that America sort of grows in leaps and bounds over the first couple of 100 years, that's pretty significant. There are a few other examples, but the way that Islam spreads, here are a couple of things that I'd like to talk about today and just introduce. Islam, part of the reason why it spreads is maybe partly the example of Muhammad. There are some controversial moves that Muhammad made, even in his own life. He admits that in certain ways he made mistakes as he was doing various things. But by and large, most Muslims, view him as a pillar of the community, as a supreme example of the kind of human we all want to be. From his early years, his word was his bond. His early years as a trader with the Bedouins, he was a man of his word. He was, by most accounts, he was not particularly lettered, but also very smart. He didn't have a university education. He wasn't a reverend doctor like Pastor Thompson. So sorry, Pastor Thompson. Maybe your career as a prophet can come another way.
Pastor.
But by most accounts, he was considered, very compassionate as well. He took great, there is something called the Constitution of Medina. After he was brought to Medina in the year 622, he establishes essentially like a constitution that's going to kind of govern the various tribes there in Medina who had some skirmishes and difficulties. And in that document, and I can share that document with you, it's actually fairly short. In that document, he outlines that there is to be respect for all people of the book. There's to be no compulsion in religion. We're to govern in very fair ways. All Muslims are required to do 5 main things. You confess that there is no God and Muhammad is his prophet, and that also includes recognition that other religions of the book also have their books and their prophets. So the first thing you do as a Muslim is you confess that there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. You also pray 5 times a day. During the month of Ramadan, you practice fasting. This is a good spiritual practice that he derives from Jewish and Christian practices. He says we give alms to the poor, mandatory almsgiving as an entire pillar, for the poor. Muhammad was in a very vulnerable position when he was a child as an orphan, and he wanted to make sure that everyone in the community is taken care of. Everyone at some point in their life should come to Mecca and should come to the Kaaba and pray there directly in front of God. And that's the pilgrimage, the Hajj. Excuse me. In a lot of ways, it's a very simple sort of religion. And I think that's part of why it spreads. In addition to that, as he was sort of laying these things out in the Constitution of Medina and other things, he also outlines how people from other religions should also be involved in governing these ways. He's saying we should govern, if Muslims are in the majority, we should govern in ways that we follow Islamic principles. But, like one of our principles is that we give alms to the poor. And so Christians and Jews should also kick in and make sure that they also give what is called a jizya, which is a non-Muslim almsgiving that will help support the wider Muslim rulership, that kind of thing. Most Christians and Jews at that time didn't view this as an imposition or, the Muslims are out of control. It was just a way for everybody to come together and chip in for the needs of the poor and for the community and that kind of thing. I think a lot of the reasons why it spread was because it's a very simple kind of religion at its core, 5 pillars. In addition to that, Muhammad establishes some ways for problem solving outside of that. He follows a verse from Surah 13, chapter 13, verse 11 in the Quran that says, Allah helps those who help themselves. All right. So as this Constitution of Medina is being set up and as sort of wider governance is being set up for this rapidly growing Islamic community, they realized right away that there would be times when they would need to go beyond the Quran and even beyond the Hadith. There were new situations that kept coming up in this rapidly expanding, group, this community, and then what eventually becomes a whole civilization. There were new situations, and what essentially becomes established there, what gets established is that Muhammad and others say, as with all religions, we have holy books. We have the traditions of our founding fathers and mothers, right? We have those traditions of the learned and the pious and that kind of thing. But a couple of things can really help us go beyond that. First of all, Muhammad establishes what is called community consensus. All right, so this is called ijma, community consensus. Basically what he says is, all right, if there's some new situation that comes up, there's some new conflict between the tribes or something like that. First of all, we're going to follow Quranic principles. Then we'll follow some of the traditions that are being established by the leaders, the hadith. But in addition to that, we're going to gather together what is called a shura, which is a kind of community council, and it would have Jews and Christians and others in that community council. And we can use community consensus to try to arrive at a reasonable decision. He says, we need to cultivate our intellectual and spiritual growth and use that. God gives us an intellect. Allah helps those who help themselves. God gives us an intellect. And with that, we can extrapolate beyond the Quran and the Hadith. In addition to that, we can, by analogy, we can extrapolate out beyond the Quran. Like, for example, in the Quran, it says alcohol is haram, which is forbidden. We can think today about methamphetamine, for example. Methamphetamine was not a part of the ancient world, of course. So what would Islam say about that? Well, they can say that by analogy, what is called qiyas, by analogy, we can use our God-given intellect and we can extrapolate out beyond Quranic principles, and we can come up with rules that govern us that way as well. All right? It's through this kind of emphasis on intellectual and spiritual growth. God helps those who help themselves. So Muhammad and his followers and those people who succeeded him, they set up active learning centers, learn about the world, study the great philosophies, and even study the great religions of the world. So the active study of Christianity and Judaism and Greek philosophy and mathematics and all of this stuff began to happen in Muhammad's own time. But then even in the years that follow, in Damascus and Cordoba and Isfahan in Iran and Cairo in Egypt, and then on into India and Delhi and other places, some of the first and most well-established universities, we can call them universities, were set up in the Muslim world. And that's where we had mentioned last time, even algebra, right? The advancements in medicine and sciences and math and even the arts and all kinds of things. There was just this hunger for knowledge. And why? Because God helps those who help themselves. So let's build a community. Let's look interior to ourselves and work to become a better person. There is a sixth teaching here that I'd like to sort of talk about. It is what becomes known as jihad. Jihad. Now, this is a word that we've heard a lot about, of course, in the last, 20, 30 years, something like that. What the word means, there are actually two main meanings in Islam. There is what is called jihad al-akbar, which means the greater jihad, and then jihad al-asghar, which means the lesser jihad. Most Muslims wake up every day and they say, I'm going to engage in jihad, but it's not the jihad that we think about on the news. It's not sort of holy war or something it's translated as often. The greater meaning of it means an internal, the word means in Arabic, jahada, means to struggle. It means to struggle. And so struggle every day, the primary meaning of it is an interior struggle to be a better person, seek intellectual growth, spiritual growth, work to, in the way that the Islamic texts phrase it, work to commend the good and forbid the evil. Every day, struggle that way with, under the creation of God and with the communities around us, commend the good and forbid the evil. Every harm that you do out in the world is going to be unfurled at your death, and there are two angels on your shoulders, Munkir and Nakir, and one will unfurl the scroll of good acts, the other one will unfurl the scroll of bad acts, and you'll have to give an account on the day of judgment. There is, Islam shares with Christianity and some forms of Judaism this idea of a day of judgment. And so, the idea every day is to struggle to be a better person, struggle to commend the good and forbid the evil. The lesser jihad does mean external struggle to defend the community. All right, so it can also mean struggle, but it's in the defense of especially the vulnerable in the community. But this is also governed highly by Islamic traditions. The overwhelming majority of Muslims, when they hear this word, jihad al-asghar, the lesser jihad, first of all, you'll never be successfully engaged in physically defending the community unless you are a pious person, unless you are someone who is engaged in the lesser jihad, all right? And in addition to that, the Quran and even then the Hadith are all very clear. If you're engaged in physical defense, you take up arms against the community, it's always to be defensive. You're never to involve non-combatants. There are even hadith that talk about how you shouldn't harm shrubbery in engaging in jihad. So you can't go in and hurt buildings or trees or anything like that, right? The way that it's sort of become misshapen by these minority kind of militant groups, most Muslims would look at that and say, this is not the Islam that I know. Instead, Islamic traditions, I would point to the amazing kind of contributions to world cultures that Islam has given. Things, everything from hospitals to universities to optics to anesthesia in a lot of significant ways. Epidemiology was first developed by Ibn Sina in Baghdad in the 12th and 13th centuries. He hung pieces of meat around Baghdad and he studied how diseases were related to how the meat would rot, and he would study microbes and also fly larvae and all kinds of things. And he was partly doing it to understand the nature of how diseases are passed between people, but also he reasoned that you put the hospital, the house of healing, in the area of the city where the disease is less rampant and where meat rots, not as fast, and there aren't all of these microbes, and thus are born hospitals and all kinds of things. Aside from I mentioned the Taj Mahal, you all have to go, right? Everybody put up their right hand. I will go to the Taj Mahal before, I go to the hereafter. It's an amazing place, and the contributions in art and music and literature and then the sciences and all kinds of things, just absolutely amazing. So at any rate, that kind of brings us through most of the rest of the teaching from what I had last week. I did send to Pastor Eric. I sent him this morning. And we could go over this maybe in some of the questions. I had mentioned last time that I had another sort of handout. This one is much, much more dense. This is a handout that talks about some of the diversity in the Muslim world. And really, this is one that I give to my students. And it's sort of a summary of the main schools of Quranic interpretation. And I use this to show how in the Muslim world, There's actually tremendous diversity. Most Muslims belong what I would call over here on the left, what I
Eric,
would call.
do you
Yes.
want to put that map up quickly?
Is it not up there? Can you not see it? I have schools of Sunni and Shia jurisprudence.
No, we can't see it.
Oh, okay. 1 second here. I thought that I had it up there. All right, how's that?
Mhm.
The magic of technology. What would Muhammad say? At any rate, this is a very dense chart again, and it does have a map on the back that shows where some of these schools are, the major schools of Islamic jurisprudence. All that I would say about this in a minute or so is just that the majority are over here on the left side of the school, of these schools. They are toward the kind of rationalist side. They place a great emphasis on personal interpretation. Here is some of the stuff that I was talking about. Muslims would use the Quran and the Hadith, and especially limited community consensus, limited analogy, that kind of thing. Most Muslims would be over here. They would trust in the God-given intellect. The literalist schools do exist in a few places, in Arabia, northern Pakistan, Afghanistan, but they are by far the minority. They have very limited hadith and that sort of thing. They follow a kind of literalism. These are the schools that have begotten what becomes known as Wahhabi teachings. Most Muslims are over here, though, on the left of this chart, or the middle, something like that. There's a reason why in the Arab Spring there were so many who were advocating for democracy and all kinds of things. If you go back to this idea of community consensus and the age-old practices of the Shura Council, many Muslims today will argue that democracy has been a part of the Muslim world for a long, long time. Yeah.
Can I share that map quickly?
Absolutely. Yeah. Can you not see it?
We see a Word document. Now we see a map.
Yeah. Okay. So there is the map on the back side of that Word document. The map is also there. And Pastor Eric can email it out to everyone, and you could take a closer look. We don't have enough time to kind of go through that whole thing, but you can get a sense. Most of the areas, wherever you see kind of, in Saudi Arabia, this is where a lot of the very smallest, literalist schools called the Hanbali school. In Saudi Arabia, a few areas in Afghanistan and Pakistan, those two areas. But outside of that, all of those sort of lighter green, orange, all those areas of North Africa, with a few exceptions in places like Sudan and a few other places. There are groups like Abu Sayyaf and all of that. But for the most part, the majority of those colors that you see there are either they are toward the progressive rationalist side. Those schools, Mu'tazila, they're called, and other schools, Hanafi.
So do they train? Do they have a seminary like we have a seminary? Do they have a training for pastors?
So,
or what do they call their clergy?
No, that's a great question. So they don't have a sort of ordination in the Muslim world, at least especially the Sunni Muslim world. They aren't pastors in that sense. But what they do have seminaries, and what they do is teach. They teach, the Quran. They teach the Hadith. They teach a lot of the other texts that talk about community consensus and analogy and all sorts of things. When you become someone who is a graduate of one of those seminaries, and I think seminary is a great word here. There are a lot of similarities between even Lutheran seminaries and what has been occurring for 1,300, 1,400 years in these schools of learning. You become what is known as an alim, an alim. An alim is based on the Arabic root for the word ilm, which means knowledge. All right. So it means that you become a learned one. And if you become an alim, it means that you are then a part of this group who are known as the ulama. Ulama, U-L-U-M-A. And sometimes you'll hear that word on the news here and there. The ulama are the learned ones in the community. If there is need for kind of a decision, is it okay to think of methamphetamine as like alcohol and therefore we shouldn't do it? They will go to one of these alims, and based on the learning of that alim, they will then, issue what is known as a fatwa. A fatwa is just a decision. It's an edict or something like that. They're not viewed as clergy. They're viewed as learned ones, all right? And so they're kind of like theologians or jurists or something like that. Now, in addition to that, in the Quran, in the mosques, there will be prayer leaders, and these are called imams. An imam can be anybody, though. Even somebody like me who is not ordained, if I know a couple of surahs, I had to memorize the first surah when I was studying at Luther Seminary. If I know that surah and one other one, and I do have a couple other short ones memorized, but if I had to do those, if I had those two surahs, and then also I know the actions of the prayers, and I know how to recite them properly, I can lead prayer. There is no ordination in that sense. And so between the two of these, the ulama and then the imams, you have leadership in the Muslim world. There's no pope or anything like that.
Okay. So what is the meaning of the leader? I guess I was thinking about, and I can't think of it. I lost it. Yeah, I guess Ayatollah is what I was thinking of.
There's another word. I mean, maybe this is what you were. This might be what you were asking about. There is another title that is given in the Muslim world, and the title is Ayatollah.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. Okay. I was guessing there, and I thought maybe that's where you were headed. So the title is Ayatollah, and I can say a few things about that. So what I was saying before about ulama, and then about imams, that is true of the Sunni world. So that's true of 85% of all Muslims, all right? But going all the way back to when Muhammad dies in 632, there is this question of who should succeed him. The majority say we should follow the general ways of the Prophet, what is known as the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the Quran and the Hadith and the ways of the community. All that together become known as the Sunnah, and those who follow that way become known as Sunnis, the followers of the general ways of the Prophet. However, there was a minority who said, no, we should keep leadership within the family of the Prophet. And so they nominated as a successor to Muhammad, Ali, his son-in-law, thinking that not only is he married to Fatima, his daughter, but also the grandsons would be his, direct successors. And so there's Hassan and Hussein become Ali and Fatima's grandchildren. And what happens is that minority community, they don't win the day. And for the first few times, they don't win the day. Eventually, the fourth leader of the Muslim community becomes Ali. This way of thinking about leadership as divinely given through Muhammad and then through the successors of Muhammad, that becomes the leadership model in what becomes known as the Shi'atu Ali movement, the party of Ali. And they become known as the Shiites. They're in Iran and Lebanon and a few other places. They're 15% of the Muslim world. They view their leaders to the present day those who go through this kind of seminary education, they do view their leaders as kind of ordained in a lot of ways. It's called Nas, which is a kind of spiritual designation. They become known as the Ayatollah. And that word, that word means literally, ayat means word or verse, and it means the verse or the word of God.
Okay.
And so that is much more like a kind of clergy leadership. So Ayatollah Khomeini, his word, and then there are other ayatollahs. There are many ayatollahs at any one time. One becomes a supreme leader and sort of is in charge of the others, especially in Iran. But there are lots of other ayatollahs as well. But they become, for their community, kind of the mode of interpretation for that community.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Very good.
Something like apostolic succession then.
Yeah, I think it's very much like that. That idea of Nas, of spiritual succession. You actually put on a mantle, like from one to another. When Pastor Eric and I got our PhDs, you have this conferral of this, sash kind of thing, right? You're hooded, right? And that too is given in the Shia community. When you graduate and you become a learned one, and you become someone who is the spiritually designated, usually it has to be in the family of the prophet, but you can be conferred with this mantle that you wear, and it's recognized then that as you walk around with this, apostolic succession. That's a great equivalent, I think.
Isn't
Sure.
that how Elijah passed being the prophet to Elisha?
Yeah.
Physical mantle.
Exactly. I think very similar. Again, are these practices taken from Christianity, from Christian practices? Oftentimes we don't know, but there's so many similarities in the DNA between these religions. Yes, there are points of great division. I mentioned before I was in the military. I almost had to go and fight in the Gulf War. I was within a whisker. We actually had our orders, but we were deactivated. I'm very familiar with some of, these, so-called clash of civilizations between Islam and, Muslim communities and other communities and that kind of thing. But I tell you, if you back up and take kind of a long view and you look at the contributions of Islamic cultures to world cultures, and then you look at kind of our common heritage and all of these little things, Aaron, like, the way that leadership is passed in Jewish, Christian, and, Islamic modes of succession, you start to realize we are Abrahamic. I think we share 98% DNA, something like that. We're brothers and sisters in a lot of ways.
Which is the oldest, the Sunni or the Shiites?
Well, that's a good question. Which is the oldest, the Sunni or the Shia? They happened, it really happened and was solidified basically at the same time in the year 680. So after Muhammad dies in 632, in the few decades that follow after that, this comes to a head in this place called Karbala, just south of Baghdad in the year 680. And there is a kind of, the majority Sunni were able to defeat this much smaller Shia army. But what happens is that there is a remnant of that army that are able to escape, and they're able to continue to exist as, in their view, a kind of persecuted minority, a deeply spiritual community. They go off into exile, they settle in Iran. And then, from that year 680, we can say we really get Sunni Islam over here and Shia Islam over there, and then, you can go all the way up to the modern Iran-Iraq war. And that was, in a lot of ways, a clash between Sunnis and Shia. Shia Iranians and then Sunni, at least represented by Saddam Hussein. There were many significant Shia in Iraq, in southern Iraq and that kind of thing. But a lot of the Sunnis in Iraq viewed themselves as recreating the Battle of Karbala.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So is there a grave for Muhammad? Do they know where he was buried or not?
Yeah, there is a grave in Medina. I mentioned that Muhammad spent most of his early years in Mecca. That's where he was born, and that's where the Kaaba is and all of that. But remember, in 622, he was invited to the north to Yathrib, this sort of oasis that had small Jewish tribes and Christian tribes and, a lot of other Arab tribes. And he was invited in to kind of become the mayor and solve the issues. And he was successful in doing that. He lives there the rest of his life. And when he dies, his grave then is there in what becomes known as Medinat Nabi, which is the city of the prophet, or Medina for short. So when Muslims go on the Hajj, when they go on the pilgrimage, they go to Mecca. But one of the other main places that they go is that they travel an hour north and they go to Medina and they visit his grave.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there?
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
When there was the Great Fire of the Library of Alexandria, I think, wasn't it the Muslims who saved everything because they had copies of all the ancient scrolls and so on? So the repository of human knowledge actually rested, the saving of that rested with the Muslims.
This is very true. In the medieval Christian church, there were all of these, these rumors of long lost texts, especially by the philosopher Aristotle. And, they knew in a lot of ways the medieval Christian church was based on the philosophies of Plato, but they knew about this other great, Greek philosopher named Aristotle, and they knew some of his texts, but they knew that there were a lot more texts out there, that he was this great philosopher and that, he taught a whole different way of thinking about things, empirical knowledge and scientific, sort of early scientific ways of thinking. The idea that in the world we can find these eternal forms of things, as opposed to way up in the heavens. It was a whole different way of thinking. When that library burned and, going back to when Muhammad dies in 632 in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Isfahan, and all sorts of other places, the teachings of Aristotle were sought after, and Plato, and all of, the great learning of the world was sought after. Bring it here. We will translate it into Arabic and we will preserve it. This is exactly what happens. What happens with the Renaissance in Europe, at least in part, is based on the city of Cordoba and a few places in Spain and in Southern Europe, where there were significant communities of Jews and Christians and Muslims. And what starts to happen is that they start to translate some of these ancient Arabic texts into the languages of Europe. Yep. And you get a rediscovery of Aristotle. And all of a sudden, from that, a whole new way of thinking with science and emphasis on the humanities and all kinds of things. And this becomes known as the Renaissance. And
St. Thomas.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. St. Thomas was also brought as well. I mean, significant translation bureaus in Cordoba and other places. And, European culture would not be nearly what it is were it not for the 1,000 years of Islamic learning, or 800 years or something like that. Yeah. They took Aristotle and all of these other sciences and teachings, and then they took it much further and then passed it on into Europe.
It pays to remember how connected we all are.
Yeah, again, this goes back to that, we're brothers and sisters in so many ways. It just on a personal note, everywhere that I go in the Muslim world, again, you're just, you're greeted wholeheartedly, assalamu alaikum, peace be to you. And that means you're recognized as a member of the Abrahamic religion, as a part of this sort of joint heritage. We're 98% DNA similar anyway. it's not unlike Christians, how we split into Protestants and Catholics and all sorts of other groups. We would still, when the end comes to the end, we will say that we are all still Christians. It's just we've taken it this way or that way, or that kind of thing. It's not that we should collapse all differences between Christianity and Islam. I don't mean that. We're not, I don't mean a kind of mushy sameness, right? I just mean that in so many ways we have so much in common, and that often gets lost in a divisive world.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Sir, I think about a week ago, I was watching on POV a documentary about a couple from Iran. And this couple had committed adultery. And they had a child together, not by their spouses. It was called Love Child.
Okay.
And they escaped from Iran and are living as refugees in Turkey. And the reason they escaped or left Iran was because adultery is treated by stoning, death for committing adultery. A man can be executed. And so I guess, and the documentary was about their struggle, living in Turkey, trying to come to the United States, and, that situation being thwarted. But, I guess it is practices like that as horrifying.
Right.
Beheading people, those sorts of things in the Muslim world. And how can a religion practice, such, of course, we know what Christ said about adultery. He stopped, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. So, I guess those sorts of practices are oppressive situation there is for women in countries like Afghanistan. So, those, if those are a part of the Islamic religion, we hear about Sharia and Sharia law. And, so what, maybe not every Islamic nation, practices those, but it's hard for us to, digest that kind of social situation.
Sure. And I think I caught most of your question. You were either I was fading out or you were fading out a bit, but I understand. I think pretty much what you were asking there about adultery and stoning to death for such things in Iran and that sort of thing. You also then mentioned Sharia at the end. That graph that I showed you earlier, with the Sunni and the Shia schools, and the sort of rationalist schools on the left and the traditionalist schools on the right, that is Sharia. And that's partly why I show that in my classes at the university, is that when we hear the word Sharia means a lot of different things. It's like saying Jewish law. When we say Jewish law, we're maybe more familiar that in the contemporary world, there are at least three different ways of interpreting this. We have the Orthodox on the one side, you know, the sort of literalist interpretations of the Torah and the, you know, the traditions of Jewish jurists and others who have decided a lot of these issues. The Orthodox will try to follow all of those in as, you know, significant a way as is possible, right? And then we also have on the other side sort of Reformed Jews, right, who will say, well, yeah, maybe I don't have to wear a prayer shawl in the synagogue in order for my prayer to be heard by God, you know. And so we can think about how some of these laws are flexible and malleable, and we can think of them in new situations. We can emphasize human rights and all kinds of things like that. So you get the ordination of women in Reformed Judaism that you would never get in Orthodox Judaism. And then you have conservative Jews in the middle. All of that becomes Jewish law. And it's similar in the Muslim world, where you have a wide variety, very wide variety. So this idea that Sharia somehow is coming to the West, and, you know, Muslims seek to, you know, install Sharia in our communities and that kind of thing. The way that most Muslims would see that is, well, yeah, of course, I'm going to live my life according to the Quran and the Hadith, but also it's fully compatible with my ideas of community consensus and analogy and all of that. It's fully compatible with Western democracy, with American democracy. One doesn't supplant the other, and there isn't in the, you know, to refer to your specific examples, in the wider Muslim world, you know, we hear about, you know, will you get your hands chopped off if you're caught stealing, or, you know, stoning for adultery, or in Afghanistan, if a woman is seen without this burqa kind of face mesh, that they get beaten with sticks and that kind of thing. The way that the overwhelming majority of Muslims would say that those practices were so much a part of that ancient time and that ancient culture that they have no place in the modern world. Women are always to be uplifted. Human beings are to be respected. There is you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that has been signed on by the United Nations. Just about every Muslim nation, so-called Muslim majority nation, has signed on to those documents. Most Muslims would look at those things, those practices, and they would say that, first of all, the majority wouldn't think that way. And then second of all, they would talk about how there is Islam, the religion, and then there is the culture that is aside from that, right? I mean, there are kind of cultural realities that are aside from that, in the same way that we can talk about all sorts of different modes of Christianity. We have Northern Irish Catholicism. We have Appalachian.
And one thing I would say is that we also, I mean, I think we as Americans sometimes like to look at these sorts of documentaries coming from Iran or India or Afghanistan or these news stories and be like, oh, and we forget that people are being killed because of the color of their skin, not by police officers, but by like just regular citizens in our country all the time. I mean, and we just we like to see that horrific stuff across boundaries, but we don't like to admit that it's happening. And we also don't like to admit other things that we as a culture fail at that would violate Christian values. There are like 600 references to taking care of the poor and the needy in the Christian Bible. There are like 6 references about homosexuality. And yet there are churches these days that are way more worked up about the fact that we have allowed gay people to marry and are not addressing the poverty issue. So, yeah, I mean, for me, the analogy I've been thinking about is what we know about Islam would be like saying that everything we knew about Norwegians and Swedes was found in Ole and Lena jokes. Think about that for a second. I mean, because that's what we most Americans, like, we just have these sort of like propagandized snippets from news sources that kind of reach the top of our reading list, and we use that as, oh man, Sharia law. Heck, we have Sharia law. North Dakota, when did you guys finally start being able to go to the stores before noon on Sundays?
Yeah.
Like 2 years ago. You guys have laws here. You know, I mean, Minnesota, when could you buy alcohol on Sundays? Like 2 years ago, right? So the fact that, you know, that's why when I hear these arguments, I'm like, what? You know, like, let's take a look at ourselves first. And certainly that stuff is horrible. I mean, in India, even though the caste system no longer exists, it still exists and people get killed because of it. So it's, yeah, we just need to kind of balance those sort of viewpoints, I think.
Yeah,
I don't know, is that helpful? Because to me, it's like, I think we sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question. I mean, I would just add to that I think, you know, just personal experiences, you know, I love America. I love everything about it. I love being a Christian. But when I go to India, say, and I live in a Muslim community much of the time when I'm in India, I know about what's happening in America, and I compare it to kind of what's happening on the ground in the communities where I'm living there. And, you know, I hate to say it, but I feel, you know, much more afraid walking around southern Chicago, maybe, you know, the south part of Chicago, than I would in, you know, basically anywhere in the Muslim world, you know, that kind of thing. I mean, you know, if there is any comparison to be made, you know, we have to be aware of the ways in which if there is violence in our own culture, you know, there are some ways in which even religiously that we have had an influence on that, or we're on the hook for that, or, you know, something like that. Some of those practices are all too easily sort of collapsed into, oh, this is one of the main teachings of Islam. And it's just not. It's just not.
And Eric, you have to be careful in South Fargo too, because you might be run over by a moose.
South Fargo, I will remember that when I'm there. I'll be with you, so I'll throw you in front of the moose.
True story.
Is the moose still on the loose?
Moose is on the loose.
Doesn't get shot.
Well,
we have
sorry.
Things in town.
In Fargo before. Sadly.
I'm sure there are plenty of folks up here that would love to take a shot at that moose. People up here.
Well, I'm very sorry, everybody, but if I'm with Pastor Eric when I'm there, I'm throwing him in front of the moose. If it happens.
Well, it's 11:30. How about did anyone who hasn't asked a question yet have one last question to throw out there?
Yeah, I have one. In the Kaaba, is that opened up, or is it just kind of a sealed box?
It's a sealed box with a very large kind of carpeted covering over it. Once a year, they remove that covering, they cleanse it, which is what Muhammad did in the last year of his life. They cleanse it, clean it, recarpet it, and then it's sealed again for another year.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, great question.
Very good.
Questions like that, or?
I'd like to say thank you for all the
Yeah, thank you.
everything.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Next Sunday we'll do Hinduism, and it's a huge topic, and so we're gonna kind of get Eric to just kind of hit some highlights. If you have any pressing questions about Hinduism, feel free to email those to me. I'll forward them on to Eric, and I did see the email he sent me, and I'll get that out to folks.
Great.
I think either Aaron or I have this, know who's attending right now. And then the other thing is I did record this session. So if you know folks who wanted to be here, you know, we'll try to find a way to post this. I'm not exactly sure. It probably will have to be YouTube is my guess. So, but we'll find a way to link it. So,
oh man, I'm going to be out on YouTube. Questions. I'm going to be out on YouTube.
Yes.
Oh boy.
We have your permission, I hope.
Here we go.
It won't be public. It'll just be something.
Okay, good. Safe.
It'll end up with, 17 views. So.
Yes, 17, right.
Okay, well,
Correct.
hey, thank you everybody for your questions, and yeah, keep exploring Islam. There's so much more to learn about this wonderful religion. My neighbor, actually, where I live in my cul-de-sac across the way, is Muslim, and one of the best ways I've heard to do this is to ask folks who are Muslim to teach you about their religion.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah.
Yep.
There is a book that I would recommend. One of my friends, Reza Aslan, has a book in your nearest Barnes and Noble or wherever, No God But God. I actually had to cover his classes while he was off in New York booking, making a deal for this book. So he still owes me for that.
That's great.
Thank you.
Well,
all.
thank you, everybody. I'm
Thank
going to end the meeting now, but I appreciate everyone's time, and hopefully see you next Sunday.
Thank you. Thank you
Take
very
care,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.